Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and get $500 off install when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off install when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. Hey guys, it's Lawrence, and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that shows you how to optimize your health and your high-intensity training and start and grow your own high-intensity strength training business. My former guests include the who's who in HIIT, people like Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and John Little, paleo pioneers like Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf, successful strength training entrepreneurs like Luke Carlson, Roger Schwab, and Mark Alexander, productivity experts, New York Times bestselling authors, high-intensity training bodybuilders, and everything in between. My guest today is Dr. Martin Gibala, whose name I'm sure you are familiar with. Dr. Gibala is a professor and chair of the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. His research on the health benefits of interval training has attracted immense scientific attention and worldwide media coverage. He is the author of a best-selling book, The 1 Minute Workout: Science Shows a Way to Get Fit That's Smarter, Faster, Shorter. You can connect with Martin via Twitter. His handle is @GibalaM. That's GIBALAM. And this was a really exciting podcast. Ever since learning about Martin and the McMaster studies in Body by Science that talked about the benefits of high intensity interval training versus steady state exercise, really blew my mind and really kind of triggered my curiosity. It was nuts for me to read and learn that you could get just as much benefits in terms of adaptations and improvements from such a short amount of exercise versus the traditional steady state, hours and hours of exercise every week, and which most people do, and I used to do. So very cool to finally get Martin on the podcast to actually talk about this. And one of the other things I was really curious about is, how, if you're doing high intensity strength training and you're employing things like the rush factor and you're making it really intense, so do you really need high intensity interval training as well? Like, are we missing out in terms of improving other outcomes in our health if we're not doing both? So I try to explore that in this one. Now, Dr. Martin Gibala is a bit of a big deal. So I was a little bit nervous in this one, I will admit, and you'll probably be able to see that or hear that. So please, do be patient. It probably takes me at least 10, 20 minutes just to warm up, but there is some amazing content in this one. I believe that Martin and I explore territory which just hasn't been covered in any other podcast he's done. We really get into the weeds on some of these topics and nuances of exercise. So I think you're going to really, really enjoy this. I will also point you to Tim Ferriss's episode with Martin. If you just go to or just Google Tim Ferriss and Martin Gibala, you'll be able to listen to his episode where Tim and Martin explore the protocol in more detail. So I think that's good as a complement to this one. So in this episode, we talk about the difference between high intensity interval training and high intensity strength training. Do you really need both? It's a big question. We talk about the potential downsides of high intensity interval training. And we talk about how high intensity interval training can help to prepare you for long endurance based events, things like Tough Mudder or Survival of the Fittest, some of these off-road events, or even longer kind of marathon based events, and much, much more. I do challenge Martin a few times on this podcast to really try and answer some of these questions that I have. And I think you're going to really enjoy hearing what Martin has to say. So now I give you, without any further ado, Dr. Martin Gibala. Martin, welcome to Corporate Warrior. Real honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So obviously, as we were talking about offline, I've known of you for ages, since reading Body by Science and since obviously learning about some of the studies from the masters that helped underpin a lot of Doug's kind of evidence there in terms of the benefit and efficiency of high intensity interval training over steady state exercise. And so that's where I kind of first came across your work. And then obviously I heard you on Tim Ferriss, and so very, very excited to talk to you now and dig into some of the details of the type of exercise protocols that you advocate and your thoughts on the high intensity strength training side of things. I will point the listeners, if they want more context on the basics of high intensity interval training and some of the definitions, I do suggest they listen to Tim Ferriss episode, and I'll link to that from the show notes. Obviously, if there's a bit of overlap, that's not too much of an issue. So I have a few questions to start with that might seem a bit dumb, really, but I'm going to ask it because I'm really quite unsure. Is this focus on improving VO2 max with exercise? And we know that high intensity interval training can improve VO2 max quite significantly. And I just wondered, in the context of high intensity strength training, where you're doing, big multi-joint strength training exercises to muscular failure, let's say you're doing a full body workout, quite condensed and intense over sort of a 10-15 minute period. Are you going to get, in your opinion, the same improvement to VO2 max that you would from, say, high intensity interval training?
No. And, maybe we can start with some definitions. I don't know if that would be helpful. But so to me, interval training is just alternating periods of more intense effort with periods of recovery, as simple as that sounds. And I think you can broadly categorize that into aerobic style interval training, which is your traditional cardio workouts like running, cycling, rowing, and resistive interval training, which incorporates everything from calisthenics to extreme body weight style training. And so I think there is a fundamental difference in terms of some of the adaptations you will see with resistive style interval training. That being said, I think it can be a tremendous hybrid style workout. And so there's some good evidence to show that especially body weight style interval training performed with short recovery periods is a sufficient stimulus to improve cardiorespiratory fitness and VO2 max. Plus, of course, you get the strength and some hypertrophy benefits as well. The increase in VO2 max that you would see, though, I don't think is as great as you would achieve if you were doing hard cycling intervals or rowing intervals, for example.
And why is that?
I think partly there's the fundamental nature of the stimulus is different. And so when you apply a resistive type stimulus, you're going to be stimulating these growth signaling pathways. When you do, I'm sure many of your listeners would know what a Wingate test is, or this is basically 30 seconds of all out exercise. You can think of going to your gym, getting on a life cycle and turning it up to the highest setting on the bike and pedaling as hard as you can for 30 seconds. So even after 15 seconds or so, you start to slow down because it's so intense. When you do that type of cycling exercise, even though it feels very, very demanding, when we take muscle biopsies and look at the activation of these growth signaling pathways, mTOR signaling, for example, we don't see much activation. And when we've done cross-sectional studies and we look at hypertrophy. There's very little, if any, hypertrophy induced by that type of training, which is obviously very different from bodyweight style training, where we know you have some activation of those signaling pathways because it results in some hypertrophy. So I think it comes down to the fundamental nature of the stimulus is different. It depends on your goals, of course. Not everyone's goal is to completely maximize their genetic potential for VO2 max. Obviously, it's really important for health, but that's not to say someone couldn't do primarily bodyweight style interval training and still have a large boost in their cardiorespiratory fitness. I just don't think they would get to the point where they might otherwise be if they incorporated or added some traditional aerobic HIIT.
Okay, so if one were trying to optimize for VO2 max, does that correlate well with longevity? And if that's the case, should we be doing both then in that case, strength training and high intensity interval training?
I think absolutely we should be doing both. I think there's just, it's unquestioned now the importance of cardiorespiratory fitness, not only for longevity, but more importantly for something what we call health span. So we can distinguish between health span and lifespan. I think the evidence is just overwhelming that individuals who have a higher cardiorespiratory fitness just have a lower risk of all-cause mortality, a lower risk of developing many different chronic diseases. And there's been a recent call that cardiorespiratory fitness should be the fifth vital sign that we measure in the doctor's office, along with blood pressure and some of these other common metrics. So I think incorporating both styles of training is critical because we're learning more and more about the importance of resistance training, of course, for a longer, healthier life as well.
And when you say body weight, referring to what you were saying earlier, are you referring to like calisthenics, that type of resistance training?
I am. Obviously, things like push-ups, pull-ups, burpees, air squats, things like that. Obviously, many serious individuals incorporate other styles of resistance training as well. But I'm talking those types of exercises that don't require any specialized equipment in order to apply a resistive stimulus. A hotel room workout, if you will.
Cool. And just to go back to this discussion around VO2 max, it's my understanding that it's quite a difficult. Again, I'm going into territory where I'm a little bit less intelligent, but it's my understanding it's quite difficult to. It can't always be used to measure sort of respiratory fitness. In that, if it's one of those things where if you haven't been training it or practicing the skill, and then you're not going to be as effective at the test. I don't know if that's correct. You may want to correct me on that. But this is where I'm going with this is if you do improve VO2 max doing something like high intensity strength training, then maybe it's the way we're measuring. I wonder if it's the way we're measuring the improvement. That's the problem. So maybe I wonder if there's a chance that it's not. The evidence isn't quite there to say that high intensity strength training is inferior to high intensity interval training. I know it's opinion that it might be or less effective, but sorry.
No, I guess probably in the big picture, I disagree with that. Generally speaking, obviously there is some subtle nuance to, for example, if you test a cyclist, they'll tend to have a slightly higher VO2 max during cycling than an elite runner would, for example. But especially when you consider that you really only need about 50% of your muscle mass to be active in order to elicit VO2 max. And that's because it's primarily limited by the cardiovascular system. Short of someone giving up on a test, sometimes we'll test a very deconditioned or unfit individual who comes into the laboratory. They've never exercised before or very rarely. And so they're just unfamiliar with that idea of pushing. And so they frankly quit very early. And before a true VO2 max is elicited. But I would say that's actually relatively rare in our experience. And there's certainly other ways to try and assess whether a person has reached their VO2 max. So you look at things like, did they get to their age predicted maximum heart rate? If we're taking blood lactate levels, we'll measure a certain value. And normally you want to see it be 8 times rest. You can look at something called the respiratory exchange ratio or the RER. And if that's well above 1, you can pretty much be sure that a person has reached their true maximum. So I don't think it's a function so much a matter of the nature of the test. Although, as I said, there's some subtle effects that you can see in more highly trained individuals or someone who's willing to truly push themselves. And then, the other point is, depending on the nature of the test, if we see a true plateau in oxygen uptake, that by definition is VO2 max, where, you ask someone towards the end of a test, you increase the workload and their oxygen uptake just plateaus. That's the classic definition of VO2 max, is a plateau in oxygen uptake despite an increase in workload. So I would say I think I understand that, the general point you're making, and yes, there would be some validity to it in terms of specificity of tests and that. But by and large, I would disagree with the general point, because I think even in very untrained and deconditioned individuals, you can elicit their VO2 max.
Cool. Fair point. This is interesting, because I think sometimes those of us that are in the kind of high intensity strength training community need to be exposed to some of these other ideas and opinions on this type of stuff. So this is useful.
Well, and if I could just jump in there, and again, I just go back to this point. Personally speaking, obviously, I think a well-rounded approach to fitness is always best. Although I know many people are interested in efficiency, and they certainly don't want to be doing things that they don't feel they need to be doing. I think someone could maintain a very high overall level of fitness, both aerobically and certainly from a strength side of things, by primarily or almost exclusively doing resistive based workouts. So I think you could manipulate that type of training to make it very, very effective. I guess I would submit that even an individual doing that might benefit from some short, hard sprints on the track, or some short, hard hill or stair workouts, or some short, hard, vigorous bursts of exercise on the bike. I think they could potentiate their aerobic fitness if they were to include that type of training in addition to the other stuff they're doing.
Sure. I wonder, there's a slight nuance that I just want to ask you about is, one of the things that some high intensity training practitioners advocate is kind of speed. Let me rephrase. It's just moving as fast as possible between exercises. Not so that one is, nauseous and going to faint, but just trying to set up all of the machines or exercises in advance so that you can swiftly move from one machine to the other for that kind of metabolic benefit. Do you think in that context that might be equal to or close to as effective for improvements in fitness, or do you still think even if you do it that way, that it's still kind of falling short potentially?
My honest answer is I don't know, although I'm happy to speculate. And when I say I don't know, I don't think there's I don't think science has the answer right now. And you can broadly look at it in two ways. So on the one hand, if you give yourself very long periods of recovery, that's going to maximize the absolute power that you can generate during repeated intervals. Now, conversely, if you keep recovery periods very short, the metabolic stress may be even higher, and it's certainly going to feel much tougher because you're fatiguing, and the absolute power that you generate may actually, it's likely to be lower on repeated intervals. And I still think we don't know whether it's absolute power over the series of intervals or relative metabolic stress that's the most important driver. And obviously, it's probably some combination of both. And a varied approach to training is going to make sure that you incorporate all of those. I often use the stock market analogy, that we know, generally speaking, the best way for long-term financial success is, investing in various different strategies and approaches and not picking one specific stock. Now, you may hit a home run with that specific stock and it may work very well for you, but it's probably not the best approach overall. And so again, I think it's why a varied approach to fitness is always best. I'm a fan of the Goldilocks approach, where you're probably taking some sort of middle ground in terms of recovery. That being said, we were talking offline that I just came from the American College of Sports Medicine meeting, and actually a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Jim Potvin, presented a phenomenal tutorial lecture on motor units. And motor units, of course, are basically the nerves that innervate muscle fibers. And he's done some tremendous work modeling motor units and how they turn on and turn off. And I think the suggestion coming away from his talk was that shorter recovery periods might be best in order to maximize motor unit activation over the course of a series of intervals. So, I think at the end of the day, a varied approach is best. So sometimes you're going to give yourself longer periods of recovery so that absolute power is highest during your intervals. And sometimes you want to make it tough on yourself. Other ways you can make it tough, of course, are by restricting carbohydrate intake. And, there's a whole school of thought now in the whole field of, training low, which doesn't mean train without glycogen all the time. It means train periodically with reduced muscle glycogen. In some ways, it's analogous to what happens when you go to altitude. It may feel that the training stimulus is much harder and it hurts more to train at altitude, even though your absolute power and absolute speeds are reduced. So that's a bit of a long-winded and convoluted answer to say, I don't think we really know, which means probably varying it up is going to be your best prescription.
Oh, that's great. And I heard you talk about this whole stress versus power conundrum with Tim, I think. Because I often go into training fasted and, I've been told that's suboptimal because of glycogen depletion and that your performance won't be as good. And I just kind of think, as long as I'm fatiguing my fast twitch all my muscle fibers, then I'm going to get what I can get. And let's be honest, I'm talking about muscle hypertrophy. That's what most people seem to be quite obsessed with, or at least most of my listeners. So I'm not sure if it makes much difference whether you come into a workout. Obviously there are, I'm sure, exceptions, like if you're fasted 72 hours before or more, let's say, I don't know, perhaps that would be a very that could be very catabolic. I'm not sure.
Well, and I guess let's remember, the analogy is train low, compete high. And so I think you're right. During the course of training, you want to be have periods of low glycogen to make it more stressful. And that's probably going to optimize adaptations. But certainly you want to compete in as good a state as possible. Though, of course, bodybuilding is a little bit different from more powerlifting or whatever. Maximal strength efforts are a little different from competing in endurance sport, of course.
Yeah, and this also makes me think of what I recently interviewed Mike Bradley, who's a strength and conditioning coach for Florida State University basketball team, and he was telling me that in strength training there's always trade-offs, and it's never like one thing's better than the other, or when you get to a certain point, it's like if you're optimizing for a certain outcome, then you're probably going to sacrifice another. And I think this is perhaps similar in what you're in this context, would you say? So this whole stress versus power context is you might be enhancing your ability to, cope with stress, but you'll be sacrificing power by doing that. So it's almost becoming cognizant of that and comfortable with the trade-off, as opposed to one being better than the other.
I agree. I'm constantly getting this question, what's the best interval training workout? And for 99% of individuals, I don't think there is one. And that's why it speaks to a varied level of fitness. Now, the more elite of an athlete you are and the more specific your discipline, I think we can start to dial it in and target interval training workouts specifically for that athlete. But for the vast majority of individuals, and I would put, folks, many of whom maybe like your listeners who are, they're serious athletes, serious trainers, but they're not elite athletes. I think varying it up is going to be best for exactly what you mentioned there. It's always, I think, a series of trade-offs. And so if you spread those trade-offs around, it's probably going to lead to the best long-term adaptation.
I just want to, ask you some questions about potential downsides to high-intensity interval training. And I might be really sort of nitpicking here, but I'm just really curious. The first thing that comes to mind is that, as we were kind of talking about earlier, is if you're doing sprints on a bike or that type of equipment, that you're not going to obviously get full body muscular stimulus. And so you might not get those kind of strength and muscle mass and bone mineral density type of adaptations. So would you say in the context of that, and I know I understand, I appreciate that high intensity interval training is way better than like if someone's quite sedentary, doesn't do much at all, or perhaps just does something like jogging. But Do you think that is quite important that really you do combine it with some type of resistance training in that respect?
Yeah, I do. And, even going back to definitions, what we touched on at the start, even if we're going to talk about this aerobic interval training side of things, I would say there's sort of three types to that. High intensity interval training means it's sort of a middle ground where the threshold tends to be 80% of maximum. So if your intervals are eliciting 80% of maximum heart rate, but they're not all out and they're not maximal efforts, that's sort of the HIIT zone, if you will. And that's distinguished from sprint interval training, which is indeed characterized by all out efforts as hard as you can go pace, or if we're measuring power, higher than the power output that would elicit VO2 max. So that distinguishes HIIT from SIT. But then there's a lower range as well that I would just call light to moderate intermittent exercise. And as crazy as it sounds, even interval walking, for example, has been shown to be greater at improving blood sugar, improving fitness in people with type 2 diabetes than just steady state interval walking. So, again, let's, those are it's important to distinguish those. To go back to your question, absolutely. I think resistance exercise is a crucial element of health. My colleague is Dr. Stu Phillips, who's obviously a major proponent of resistance exercise all through the lifespan. And so Stu and I will often have these conversations, and sometimes we'll sort of have a friendly banter, what's more important, interval training or resistance training. But obviously the answer is you absolutely need to do both. And it goes back to some of the things you were alluding to there. Interval training can be a tremendously time efficient way to boost cardiorespiratory fitness, boost health markers, improve insulin sensitivity, reduce blood pressure. But resistance exercise is an absolutely crucial adjunct for functional strength, fitness, all the way through the lifespan. I'm sure you've heard of this, but there's even a school of thought that says aerobic style training is maybe more important earlier in your lifetime, and strength training becomes increasingly important later in lifetime to help maintain functional fitness. But obviously the best prescription is do both throughout your lifetime.
This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, ARX. Are you looking to create a cutting-edge, high-intensity training facility? Are you confused on what equipment to use or how to separate yourself from the masses? Well, then ARX Fit might be the answer you're looking for. I asked Mike Polano from ARX a few questions about how ARX machines are challenging the status quo of the exercise industry around the globe. Mike, if you could, give the listeners a quick summary of why ARX is so different from the traditional machines or tools they're used to seeing in most exercise facilities.
ARX is totally different than anything you've seen before. This isn't just another weight stack machine. We've looked at the last 40 years of exercise technology and used that knowledge to create something entirely new. ARX uses a new form of resistance, a motor, and we pair that motor with computer software so that we can maximize the safety, effectiveness, and efficiency of your workouts. So you may be asking, okay, but how does ARX compare to weights? Traditional machines you see in gyms today are based on lifting metal weights and battling gravity. What people don't realize is that when you're forced to lift a static weight like this, one that doesn't adapt or change while you use it, you're underloading yourself rep after rep. And this unnecessarily limits your ability to make improvements. With ARX, we've taken a totally different approach. We removed weights and gravity from the equation altogether. Instead, ARX combines our patented motorized resistance with our custom computer software to provide you with the world's safest, most effective, and most quantified form of resistance training ever. When you train with ARX, you are training to your perfect level of resistance, both positively and negatively 100% of the time. No more guessing what weight to use. ARX does all of that for you, instantly and automatically. We'll also track and measure every second of every rep, so you can quantify all of your workouts to find out if you're improving and by exactly how much. Whether your goals are bigger muscles, increased strength, stronger bones, or just to look good in a bathing suit, ARX can help you achieve all of these and more, but do so in a fraction of the time it would take compared to traditional equipment. If you're looking for the most efficient, most effective, and most quantified piece of exercise equipment on the market today, then look no further than ARX.
Thanks, Mike. That all sounds really impressive. If you'd like to learn more about ARX, visit arxfit.com and mention that you heard about ARX on the Corporate Warrior podcast to receive an exclusive deal of $500 off shipping and installation off your ARX machines. Oh yeah, I've had Stu Phillips on the podcast a couple of times. He's a great guy. And you know, again, this is a real kind of perhaps nitpicky question. But I was always a little bit concerned about mileage, although this probably pales in comparison to a lot of a lot of athletes that do high volume training. But if let's say you're doing high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, I suppose the latter being a bit more intense. You know, you're doing a fair number of rotations. Obviously, when you do your training, rotations at the hip and the knees. Do you think that there's any sort of concerns around potential long-term damage from doing this type of training? Or do you think that perhaps the volume is so insignificant that actually really it's not anything to be worried about in terms of connective tissue, joints, that type of thing?
Again, the answer is it depends. And so, for example, if you're an elite rower and you are putting in 40 hours a week of training, 20% of that being intervals is a very high absolute amount of training with intervals. If you're an average time-pressed business executive who's training seriously, but maybe only 6 or 7 hours a week, 20% is a relatively low absolute volume. And so some of these potentials for injury is obviously going to be related to absolute stress on the body. And so 1 or 2 hours is very different from 8 or 9 hours. And so that's where the answer is it depends a little bit. I think, and so when you talk to, and again, I'm coming at this from elite aerobic type exercise, triathletes, things like that, but even rowers, the general school of thought, if you talk to elite coaches and athletes, is still the 80-20 rule. So about 80%, lower moderate training and 20% high intensity intervals. I think the lower the absolute amount of hours you're training in a week, you start to shift that percentage, and you can tolerate a much higher percentage of intervals without the potential for injury. But like everything, these things are so individualized, and what one person can tolerate, another person can't. And, that's where it becomes challenging to make these general recommendations. But I would say by and large, the risk of injury is lower than we might think. I think it's great. It's more related to total absolute volume of training than intensity per se. And the last point is it totally depends on the nature of the intervals. Less or non-weight bearing activities such as cycling and rowing, the potential for injury, especially for things like knees and that, is going to be very different from all out sprints on a track or uphill running, for example.
And I guess the former is likely to be much lower risk.
Absolutely. I'll just throw myself in there as someone who has left knee osteoarthritis from surgery 25 years ago. I can't run anymore. I can't. I can still skate and play ice hockey, and I can do very hard all-out intervals on the bike. And if I'm pressed, I can even do stair climbing intervals. So if I'm traveling and there's no bike in the hotel gym, I can get away with some intensive stair climbing intervals. But if I was to go out and run on the flat, absolutely no chance, and my knee would blow up. So again, that's I think a classic illustration of where the nature of the activity is critical, even though I might be doing the same absolute intensity in all of those things.
What does your own training look like?
My own training is it's a mix of largely bodyweight style intervals. I have basically a home gym. I have a power rack there, and so I still do things like some cleans and that sort of thing. I do pull-ups on that. I do a lot of push-ups, and that's, I'm getting that age where I guess I'm starting to fall apart a little bit and have some classic old joint injuries. So I have a labral tear in my shoulder, so I don't do heavy bench press anymore, but I can do push-ups for quite a while. And so it's largely bodyweight style interval training with some, if I can call it more functional style weightlifting for strength. And my cardio is largely cycling based intervals. During long Canadian winters, it's on an exercise bike in my basement, and it's completely interval based. And now as the weather's a little bit nicer, it's almost a summer here in Canada. I ride outside a lot, but there's a lot of hills around where I live, and so even a 1 hour bike ride involves a lot of intervals because of the changes in elevation. And so those are probably my two go-to workouts that make up the majority of my training.
Oh, you make me feel a lot better about myself, because I've started cycling a lot more now, as I've realized it's just a way better way to get around where I live here in Galway in Ireland, and much better option to car for many reasons. And there's a hill right before my house, and so whilst it might be relatively flat on the way home, that hill is very, very steep. So now I feel like I'm covering that base with a little bit of interval or higher intensity cycling at the end there. So, yeah, absolutely.
It's a tremendous way to train, I think.
Yeah. So in terms of your own frequency, are we talking one strength training sort of bodyweight interval and one bike interval, or is that like once a week, or is that what's the frequency like?
Almost every other day. So okay. I would say the pattern is almost, one day is aerobic cardio and the other day is bodyweight intervals. But of course, sometimes you mix it up and you do a bit of both on the same day. Occasionally there's a day off in there, but I would say, I seriously train at least 6 days a week. Friday is always a game of ice hockey, at least, through the winter and into the spring. So that's obviously classic team sport, high intensity interval training. So pretty much doing something every day, largely alternating between bodyweight style intervals and cycling, and probably a little bit more of an emphasis on the latter.
Interesting. So previously, I remember, I can't remember the fine details, but some of the studies you've done in the past have shown there to be obviously a tremendous amount of benefit from doing high intensity interval training like exercise very infrequently, like a few times a week or something for a few minutes. Do you think that whilst that's beneficial and probably better than some of the steady state comparative exercises or that type of thing, do you think that actually, the type of frequency that you have in your own life is perhaps more optimal for health? I know that's a big question.
No, I do. Obviously, like a lot of us, I feel relatively busy and time pressed. I have 2 kids. I have a working wife, and so you want to make your training a very high quality. But obviously, to go to some of your earlier questions, and I know this is pertinent to a lot of your listeners, fully recognize the importance of resistance exercise. And so that's why I know to incorporate it. In studies, scientific studies, we often want to make things very controlled. And so if we're looking at a very specific interval training intervention, we either have people just maintain their usual lifestyle habits, or we only add the interval training because we want to look at the very specific adaptations to that style of training. But it doesn't mean that's what we would have people do in real life, because you would want to incorporate both resistance and aerobic style training. So I think there's lessons from scientific studies, but this is always the trade-off in scientific studies as well. And sort of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you make a very well-controlled scientific study, which means you control everything you're feeding individuals. You might even keep them in your lab for a period of time, so you know exactly when and what they're eating. You restrict anything else that they're doing, and then you see these changes and you say, aha, that's because of our adaptation. People will say, well, that's great, but that doesn't really reflect real life or free living individuals. And so then you do free living studies where you don't control all of those other variables. And then the criticism can be, well, how do you know that was actually due to your intervention? And so, of course, what science attempts to do is do both types of studies. After a while, a consensus starts to emerge, based on both free living, real life type studies, as well as highly controlled laboratory studies.
Yeah, that's such an important point that you raised there in terms of the shortcoming of a lot of studies, and how difficult it is to sometimes translate it into kind of the real world. I think that's a really important thing for people to be aware of. Something that's always fascinated me, and I think I probably first discovered in The 4-Hour Body by Tim Ferriss, is the concept of, or the idea of using very brief, high intensity interval training to prepare for kind of long distance type events. So like, I don't know if you're familiar over there in Canada, but we have in the UK, we have survival of the fittest and things like Tough Mudder, which are like off-road obstacle type races, which might be 10K plus a distance. And, it's my understanding that you can use, I mean, I've not actually done it personally, but you can use high intensity interval training like protocols to actually prepare in a very time efficient manner for some of these longer, more endurance based events. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, why that is in terms of why it is that we're able to use those types of protocols to actually make our performance better. It's something that's quite different in practice.
Sure. And it flies in the idea of this concept of specificity of training, right?
That's right.
Which
Yeah,
has
exactly.
jumped into a lot of us for a long time. So, I'll often get the question, could someone train for a marathon just by doing short, hard sprints? And my answer is, yes, I think they could, although I don't know that they would run the best marathon they have in them. And that's because, there's obviously benefits to a well-rounded approach. And I don't think any elite marathon coach would suggest to their athlete, you should only do some short, hard sprints to peak, for the Olympic trial. That being said, there is a lot of value in short, hard intervals for endurance type or longer aerobic type sport, or even some of the events that you were alluding to. Any event that lasts more than 5 minutes is primarily fueled by aerobic metabolism. Probably any event that lasts more than a couple of minutes actually is primarily fueled by aerobic metabolism. Any team sport, soccer, ice hockey, all of those are primarily fueled by aerobic metabolism. And so, this idea that short, hard sprints can be effective for that, it's quite an interesting issue. From a muscle perspective, I can say that the signaling pathways, or these basic biological pathways that lead to adaptation, we can trigger those in different ways. So it's not so much that interval training is doing something different in terms of the physiology. I think what's different is the trigger. And so you can elicit these adaptations by doing the more prolonged steady state type exercise, or by these short, hard pulsatile changes. And the way to think of it is the analogy of a fuel gauge, or at least it's helpful for me to think of it this way. If you sort of push on a gas pedal and hold it there for a long time, that's going to drop fuel stores in the car slowly over time. And so inside the body, there's literally proteins that serve as molecular fuel gauges or molecular sensors, and they're attuned to things like a change in glycogen level on the muscle. And that's probably a really important fuel gauge. And so the body senses this drop in muscle glycogen, says we need to cause some changes here, some adaptations. And for example, we know that the pathways that cause more mitochondria in your muscle cells, mitochondria being those components of the cell that use oxygen to burn fuels like sugars and fats. If you train in a glycogen depleted state, some of the signals that cause mitochondrial biogenesis are upregulated. And so bringing that back to sprint training, maybe with sprints, you drop these fuel gauges extremely rapidly. And so the body senses these very rapid rates of change and says, we need to cause some adaptation here. And so the same molecular signaling processes are triggered. And we've measured this in the laboratory. So we've shown that, for example, an hour or 90 minutes of traditional moderate intensity cycling, the activation of these molecular fuel gauges is exactly the same when you do a series of very short, very hard sprints. So that, at least in part, appears to be what's happening on the muscle side. On the cardiovascular side, I don't think we know as much. What's remodeling the heart and blood vessels in order to cause a greater amount of blood and oxygen to flow to tissues? We certainly know that those same things happen. If you do a prolonged bout of moderate exercise or short, hard sprints, you can see the same sort of cardiovascular remodeling, but I don't think we know as much from a mechanistic standpoint of why that happens. And that's certainly a very fruitful area of investigation that people are looking at right now.
Now, I might be bouncing around a little bit here, but you've just made me think of something is, we talked earlier about how you feel that high intensity strength training may fall short in terms of optimizing fitness on its own versus, say, high intensity interval training. Are there other benefits to high intensity interval training that we're not getting in strength training that come to mind?
Well, I get, and so again, let me take a step back. And I think I was going to make this point earlier. Sometimes people are saying, you know what, science is just telling us that something that we already know. And there's certainly lots of anecdotal reports or sort of pioneers in the field are often saying, you know what, I'm seeing this in my laboratory, which is the gym. I'm seeing this in real life. I can't really necessarily explain it, but I think this is the best. And then in some respects, science plays catch up, and just really validates things that people think they already knew, but it certainly doesn't always work out that way. And I think that's why we have to be cautious about basing things just based on what people are seeing without scientific validity. So I think science is still really important here. And that leads into my answer, which is we know a whole lot more about the science behind traditional aerobic style interval training. A lot of it based on cycling intervals, either sprint cycling or high intensity cycling. And for example, I can say, yes, if you do that, it can improve your insulin sensitivity. It can lower your blood pressure. It can cause a number of these other adaptations. And we know that now from what we call systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which is a way of looking at a large number of scientific studies and trying to draw themes from all of these studies that have been conducted. The body of evidence when it comes to high-intensity strength training, in my opinion, is just not there right now, or certainly it's much smaller than the aerobic style interval training. And so I would say that's a limitation of the science right now. And so when you say, how does it compare? I just think from a scientific perspective, there's just much more evidence. And I can speak very authoritatively to the scientific evidence around aerobic style HIIT, where it's just not there yet when it comes to high intensity resistance exercise. I think it's certainly coming. And, there was just a meta-analysis published a couple of weeks ago showing the importance of resistance training for longevity. But the overall body of evidence is just not there right now.
Cool. No, I appreciate that. And got to be careful. My cognitive bias is rearing its ugly head a bit too much in the back of my mind. And yeah, so going back, sorry, I know I'm bouncing around, but going back to talking about high intensity interval training in the context of event preparation. So to your point, it may not be optimal in isolation, but it's far more time efficient than what a professional athlete would have to do if they were trying to optimize their results for a given race.
Absolutely. And I think even if you're a highly trained athlete, there's evidence to show that, for example, trained runners who incorporate some hard 30-second sprints. So these are people who are already incorporating interval training as part of their normal training. They're very good runners. If they incorporate 30-second sprints, they see a further improvement in their performance. So this idea of short, hard sprints being beneficial, even to more trained individuals, there's definitely evidence for that. And I think without question, for less trained individuals, it's an extremely efficient way to train. And I'm careful there. I'm not up here to say interval training is a panacea or it's better for everything. And so what I keep coming back to is the efficiency of interval training. And really that means time efficiency. You can get somewhere faster and often with a lower time commitment and lower volume of training. You can get to the same point with intervals. And obviously that's attractive for individuals for a wide range of reasons.
Yeah. And I think for the listeners who perhaps aren't familiar with your work, Martin, I think, This is huge for so many people because people are so hard pressed for time, as you're saying. People are so busy that with the types of protocols that you advocate and I advocate quite often on this show, time is no longer an excuse because you can stimulate such dramatic improvements with such little time investment. So I do encourage the listeners to check out more of your work and your book, The 1 Minute Workout. That's the title, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
And to go to your point, obviously a lot of your listeners I know are interested in their own performance and things like that. But for individuals more from health related adaptations and people just starting out, a lot of people tend to be afraid of interval training. And as I alluded to earlier, even interval walking counts. So people hear interval training and they think it only means this one style of all out, as hard as you can go exercise. Clearly, that's not appropriate for some individuals, and it scares a lot of people away because of the effort required. But there's a whole range of ways to do interval exercise training, and I think it can be scaled to almost any starting level of fitness. And there's just dozens and dozens, hundreds now, studies of people with cardiometabolic health disease, so people with diabetes and metabolic syndrome and heart disease and coronary artery disease, where interval training has been applied to those individuals and shown to benefit them.
Yeah, and before we wrap up, I just wanted to quickly discuss one of your recent studies called psychological. I always get that word mixed up. Psychological and behavioral responses to interval and continuous exercise, which looked quite interesting and showed that high intensity interval training and sprint interval training was as enjoyable or preferable as moderate intensity continuous training. I think I've got those acronyms right. So from that perspective, I think that the study, from what I read there, shows that actually, participants would be just as compliant. Are we kind of saying there, with some of these more efficient exercise protocols versus more contemporary? Conventional protocols.
And no, fair. And so, first of all, this goes more to the behavioral side of things. And this is largely work that's been led by some of my colleagues, a doctoral student, Matt Stark, and his advisor, Kathleen Martin Guinness, who used to be at McMaster, and she's now at the University of British Columbia. And I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to collaborate with them on some of these more behavioral questions. And, some people, or there's a school of thought that will just discount interval training right out of hand because they say, you know what, if exercise is intense, people perceive it as aversive or unpleasant, and so they're unlikely to do it. And there's a whole school of exercise and health psychologists that would put this theory forward. And there's a whole new school, or a lot of people are saying, well, wait a minute. Continuous vigorous exercise is very different from intermittent vigorous exercise from a psychological perspective and how you feel when you do this type of training. And so there's a lot of good research being done right now saying, okay, wait a minute, some people at least actually prefer interval training to the traditional steady state approach. It's clearly not for everyone, but it comes back to this idea of individual differences. And I don't think anyone could argue that largely the one size fits all approach that we're generally advocating in public health guidelines, a lot of people aren't listening to that message. It's not to say that the science isn't good or the public, we should scrap the public health guidelines, because we shouldn't. It's based on great science. Interval training is about giving people more choices. And so let's establish the scientific validity, first of all, in terms of physiology and health, and then let's establish it from a behavioral perspective and say, you know what, at least some people prefer this, or it's more menu options that they can choose from, because so many people, I think, it's ingrained into them, oh my God, if I don't have an hour of exercise in the day and then things come up, they just blow off their workout. But if we could tell people, you know what, if you take the stairs a couple of times through the day, we call this exercise snacking, that can be extremely effective. And you know what, if you're someone, you're just starting out and you can't do 30 or 45 minutes of continuous walking, take a break, and that's okay. You're just doing interval training. And it's been applied, in studies ranging from heart patients to elite athletes who were winning gold medals at the turn of the century with this style of training. So I think that the psychological and behavioral side of things is equally important, and that goes to this whole idea of what people actually do in real life.
This is really interesting and really important because I think I'm kind of asking you this in the with some of the business owners in the back of my mind who listen to this, because I think we can be in danger of being too dogmatic about a particular exercise protocol. And I'm thinking about some of the people in high intensity strength training who are even more dogmatic about sub niches within that exercise domain, if that makes sense, and like super slow and other things, as kind of saying, this is the most effective thing. But perhaps it is, maybe, but if the person doesn't do it, it doesn't matter. And so with that, it's important to realize that, preferences are so individual, and everyone has different preferences, and being able to, and it doesn't mean you have to cater to all of them, but just appreciating that some people just aren't going to be into your service, and then maybe adding flexibility where you feel it's necessary.
Absolutely. Again, I'm citing things that you would already know, but clearly the vast majority of individuals are not physically active, and that's a problem. And so from a public health perspective, our biggest thing is let's just get people active first. And then from there, you can maybe start to subdivide, but let's just get them off the couch. And so I think the more options we can give people to start to be active, rather than trying to pigeonhole them into this is the best way of doing things. And so when it comes to interval training, it's partly my effort is to demystify it a little bit and say, again, interval walking counts. So that means if you're only, your doctor's telling you to start walking, interval training for you is picking up the pace for a few light posts and then backing off. And then also being able to say to them, as simple as that sounds, you're an obese individual with type 2 diabetes. I know that that's likely to be better for you at boosting your fitness, reducing your body fat, and reducing your blood sugar, because there's scientific studies that have shown that. And, when you can maybe couch it in that way, it helps a little bit. And you can also tell people, you know what, when they've compared this, some people actually like this more. Now, if you're someone who just wants to do moderate intensity exercise, good on you. Just do that. But it's build from there. So it's sort of demystify, get them in, start slow, and build from there.
Yeah. And with, like you were saying, with the numbers at the moment, I believe I remember talking to Dr. Wayne Westcott, and I think Stu Phillips actually said this to me, was in terms of the single digit percentage of people that actually do some kind of exercise, let alone the type of exercise we've been talking about on this podcast, is incredibly, incredibly low. It's like 5% or something like that. I'm sure you probably now clued up. Yeah.
No, but now, because sometimes, you can ask people what they do, but in the studies where they use accelerometers and basically actually objectively measure what people are doing, it's down around 15% or so are actually meeting the public health guidelines of 150 minutes a week. And of course, it's virtually impossible to track what people are doing on the resistance training side of things, even though the public health guidelines suggest they should be doing that. So I think that's where, down in the single digits for people doing both, you're probably right.
Yeah. Martin, this has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot listening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. What's the best way for the listeners to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, sure. I do have a website, martingibala.com. They can learn more about the book, The 1 Minute Workout, which was published last year by Penguin Random House. I know it's available in the UK and from leading booksellers. I'm not super active on social media, but they can also tweet me at Gibala M, which is just GIBALAM, and happy to engage in a conversation.
Excellent. And all those contact details, as well as everything that Martin and I have talked about in this episode, will be on the show notes, which will be over at corporatewarrior.co/Gibala, sorry. And for a list of all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.co/podcast. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Before you head off, head on over to corporatewarrior.co/ebook to get your free high-intensity training Google Sheet to track your training progress. And get my ebook with 20 interview transcripts with some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. Head on over to corporatewarrior.co/ebook now and enter your email address for instant access. This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and get $500 off in-store when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off in-store when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field.